Hi, my name is Amlan Roy. I do demographics and pensions research. In this short video, I'm just going to outline why demographics is a vastly misunderstood and misinterpreted subject. Yet it is so important that it affects growth of countries. Why does one country grow faster than other? So it affects inflation, taxes, asset prices, generational conflicts, and the most important thing that we are seeing today, causing a very, very uneasy geopolitical situation, high youth unemployment, not just across the Middle East, but all over the world. So demographics affects growth, inflation, taxes, and youth unemployment. Why is demographics misunderstood? Demographics is vastly misunderstood because people tend to associate it with aging. People tend to also associate it with the number of people. I claim that demographics comes from two roots, demos, which is people, and graphos, which is characteristics. So the three misinterpretations of demographics that we broadly see is people think that demographics is only about age. Countries which may look equally old actually have very different facets of unemployment, skills, etc. If you take 5 people who are the same age, they may have very different characteristics. Women are different than men. Migrants are different than natives. People who went to private school are different than public school. People who grew up in villages are different than those who grew up in mega metropolises. And lastly, if my father is a school teacher and your father is a venture capitalist or an industrialist, I tend to be different. So we need to think about demographics as a composite of age, but also other characteristics. The second thing that we get wrong is people tend to think that a lot of young people means great demographics. That is not exactly so, because 400 million young Indians or 600 million young Chinese does not make for a demographic promise, not unless you ensure that they are educated, well-skilled, and in poor health. So sometimes demographics could also be a burden. The second thing that people get wrong is they tend to think demographics is long-term. That is blatantly wrong, because today in Europe, 81% of taxes roughly go on pensions, healthcare, long-term care, not for the future, but in the here and now. What happened in Greece a few years ago still tends to affect Europe today. And the last thing that people get wrong is they think demographics is predictable. The only predictable component of demographics is that 5 years later, we'll all be 5 years older. Are we going to drive the Apple car, the Google car, or a Tesla? We don't know. Are we going to buy iPhone version 19, Samsung, Android? We don't know. So it's hard to predict how we evolve as consumers and workers. So to me, demographics comes from demos, which is people, and graphos, which is characteristic. Every individual in the world is a consumer, and there are 7.4 billion consumers because that's the population of the world. And there are roughly about 4.7 billion workers, because workers create the GDP and consumers consume the GDP. Why should we in the world of investments care? Because demographics affects every country, every individual, every household, and every region, because consumers are the biggest component of GDP, and GDP is the sum total of all activities. So let's just take a company. If I'm a worker in that company, I'm a cost. The clients bring revenues. Revenues minus cost affect income statements and balance sheets. Demographics first and foremost affects growth of different countries, and Europe and developed countries as well as China are facing a growth slowdown. Largely that's because the three components which contribute to growth are not contributing as much as they did in the 80s and 90s. What are those three components? Number one, working age population growth. Populations aren't growing in many countries because women are having fewer children, particularly in the advanced countries. In some they are growing. But the biggest reason for the slowdown of growth is labor productivity growth. And labor productivity growth has gone down because engagement and employment of young people has gone up. The only way that rich countries and more prominent emerging market countries can increase labor productivity growth is by engaging more women who live longer than men, and also by engaging more young people. I think we as a society have failed in our promise towards young people by promising older people benefits, the cost of which will be defrayed by young people through their taxes. The second thing that I also want to talk about in terms of demographics is, we've talked about growth, we've talked about the fact that roughly 22% of GDP in Europe goes on pensions, healthcare, long-term care. Europe can ill afford it, US can ill afford it, the richest country in the world can ill afford it. So we need to cut these benefits gently for people who are working but who will retire in the next 10 or 15 years, so that we give a more responsible future to the younger people. Next, I come come to asset prices. Demographics affects what's happening in equity world, it affects what's happening in bond world, because demographics tends to affect interest rates both at the short term and long term. The long term interest rates largely because pension funds, insurance companies and reinsurers are the people who demand long term bonds. If the demand for long term bonds is far greater than the supply of long term bonds, that affects why the price of long-term bonds is very high and the yield on long-term bonds is very low. Demographics also affects real estate. Older people are buying more houses, younger people who are debt-laden are buying fewer houses. So the sectors I want to end up on, which are demographically advantaged, number one sector is healthcare. MSME, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, diphtheria, malaria, tuberculosis are the scourge of the world, and therefore biotech, healthcare are important sectors. The second most important sector is financial services. With people living longer, we need to make sure that they have the funding post-retirement to live healthily and live well. Therefore, the challenge is to create new products, better risk management. So my second sector is financial services. The third sector I'm bullish on is leisure and luxury. That is because of something which is not the most desirable. The concentration of wealth and the growing inequality in the world means that the Louis Vuittons, the Lamborghinis of the world, the Hamptons of the world seem to be prime places along with Swiss private banks. Every country in the world needs new infrastructure, so I'm bullish on infrastructure, both rich and poor countries, whether it's US or it's Switzerland or China or India or Brazil or Mexico. And hand in hand with infrastructure goes natural resources. And the last sector we are bullish on is emerging markets. Not because of emerging markets on a macro basis, but because if you take soap manufacturers, you take the Walmarts, you take the Unilevers, the Procter & Gamble's, the Cadbury's and the McDonald's, they are selling a lot more by way of revenues in poor countries where people go from 0 to 1, rather than in rich countries where they probably go from 3 burgers to 3.5 burgers. So we really need to think about demographics more holistically, since it affects growth, asset prices, migration, and the way all consumers and workers live. Thank you for your time.